I never thought a driveway could cause so much chaos. But here I was, standing ankle-deep in water in my neighbor's basement, surrounded by furious homeowners and their lawyers, all because I replaced some gravel. My name is Parker Patterson, and I had lived in Meadowbrook Estates in suburban Cincinnati, Ohio, for exactly 18 months when this nightmare began. The subdivision was one of those cookie-cutter developments built in the early 2000s, where every house looked almost identical except for minor variations in shutters and garage door styles. When I bought my 3-bedroom colonial, I knew there was an HOA, but the rules seemed reasonable enough. Keep your lawn mowed. No weird paint colors. Park in your driveway or garage. The usual stuff. What I did not know was that the HOA president, Patricia Hendricks, had the temperament of a junkyard dog and the free time of a lottery winner. She was 52, according to the neighborhood gossip, though she looked older with her severely pulled-back blonde hair and perpetual scowl. Her husband worked some high-paying job that required constant travel, leaving Patricia with nothing but time to patrol the neighborhood in her white Lexus SUV, looking for violations. I first met her personally on a Tuesday morning in late March. I was heading out to my truck when she pulled up in front of my house and lowered her window. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you aware that your driveway is in violation of our community standards?" I stopped and turned around, genuinely confused. "What?" She stepped out of her SUV, clutching a leather-bound binder against her chest like a shield. "Your gravel driveway. It looks cheap and diminishes the property values of this entire neighborhood." I looked at my driveway. It was gravel, sure, the same gravel that had been there when I bought the place. The previous owners had lived there for 15 years. This has been here since the house was built. Patricia flipped through her binder with practiced efficiency. "Yes. Well, the previous owners were grandfathered in under the old rules. But when the property changed hands, the new standards apply. Section 7. Subsection C clearly states that all driveways must be either concrete or asphalt. You have 30 days to comply or face fines of $100 per day." "Wait, hold on," I said, feeling my temperature rising. "Nobody mentioned this when I bought the house. The inspection, the closing, nothing. That's not the HOA's responsibility. You should have reviewed the covenants before purchasing." She snapped the binder shut. 30 days, Mr. Patterson. The clock started yesterday when we mailed your violation notice." She climbed back into her Lexus and drove off before I could respond. I stood there, fuming, staring at my perfectly functional gravel driveway. The stones were compacted, clean, and worked just fine for my needs. But apparently they offended Patricia's delicate sensibilities. That evening, I dug through the mountain of paperwork from my home purchase until I found the HOA covenants. Sure enough, buried in page 47 of 63 pages of dense legal text, there it was. All driveways constructed or substantially altered after January 2018 must be either concrete or asphalt. The gravel driveway technically became non-compliant the moment the house changed ownership. I called my real estate agent, Marcus Chen, who had helped me buy the place. "Yeah, I remember that driveway," Marcus said, sounding apologetic. "I honestly did not think it would be an issue. The previous owners never had problems." "Well, the new HOA president seems to have a different opinion," Marcus sighed. "Patricia Hendricks. I have heard stories about her. She took over as president about 6 months ago and has been cracking down on everything. I am really sorry, Parker. You could fight it, but HOAs have a lot of legal power in Ohio." I spent the next few days researching my options. I consulted with a real estate attorney who confirmed what Marcus had said. Fighting the HOA would cost more in legal fees than just repaving the driveway, and I would probably lose anyway. The covenants were clear, even if the enforcement was selective and petty. Getting quotes for the work was its own nightmare. My driveway was about 60 feet long and 12 feet wide, coming out to around 720 square feet. The first contractor quoted me $8,000 for asphalt. The second wanted $9,000 for concrete. The third, a guy named Larry Rodriguez who came highly recommended by my coworker, quoted me $6,500 for asphalt. "I can start next week," Larry said, walking the length of my driveway. He was in his 40s, tan and weathered from years of outdoor work, with calloused hands and a no-nonsense attitude. "We will tear out the gravel, grade it properly, compact the base and lay down 3 inches of asphalt. Should take 2 days, 3 at most." "Sounds good," I said, signing his contract. I hated spending the money on something that did not need fixing, but I hated the thought of $100 daily fines even more. Larry and his crew showed up the following Tuesday at 7 in the morning with a backhoe, a steamroller, and a dump truck. My neighbors came out to watch, some offering sympathetic waves. Everyone knew about Patricia's enforcement campaign. 2 other houses on my street had already been forced to make expensive changes, one for having the wrong shade of shutters and another for a mailbox that was 3 inches too tall. The work went smoothly at first. Larry's crew removed the gravel, hauled it away, and began grading the soil underneath. That is when Larry discovered something interesting. "Hey, Parker, come look at this," he called out around noon on the first day. I walked over to where he stood at the edge of my property line. He pointed to a section where the soil sloped noticeably downward, away from my house and toward the properties behind me. "See this grade? Your gravel driveway was letting water drain right through it and down this slope. Once we pave this with asphalt, that water is going to run off differently. It is going to pool at the edges unless we adjust the grading." "Okay, so adjust it," I said. Larry scratched his jaw. "That is going to cost more. We need to build up the edges and create a proper crown so water runs off to the sides. Otherwise, you will have drainage problems." "How much more?" "Probably another 1,000. I groaned but agreed. I was already in for 6,500. What was another 1,000? Besides, I did not want water pooling around my foundation. Larry's crew spent the rest of that day and most of the next grading and compacting the base. They built up the edges slightly and created a gentle crown down the center of the driveway so water would run off to both sides. On Wednesday afternoon, the asphalt truck arrived and they began laying down the fresh, dark pavement. Patricia drove by twice during the work, and I saw her nod approvingly from her SUV. At least she would be off my back. The crew finished Wednesday evening, and I had a beautiful new asphalt driveway. It looked professional, clean, and exactly like every other driveway in the neighborhood. Larry put up caution tape and orange cones to keep anyone from driving on it until it cured properly. "Give it 48 hours before you drive on it," Larry said, packing up his equipment. "And avoid parking in the same spot for too long for the first week. The asphalt needs time to fully harden." I thanked him, transferred the final payment, and went inside, relieved that the entire ordeal was over. I was wrong. Thursday morning, I woke to someone pounding on my front door. I stumbled downstairs in my pajamas and opened it to find my neighbor from directly behind me, Greg Sullivan, standing there in rubber boots with water dripping off his pants. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded. "What? Good morning to you too. My basement is flooded. 3 inches of water. Everything is ruined." I blinked, trying to wake up and process what he was saying. "What does that have to do with me? Your new driveway. All the water that used to drain through your gravel is now running straight down into my yard and seeping into my basement. Get your shoes on and come look." I threw on sneakers and a jacket and followed Greg through the gap between our properties. His backyard was a swamp. Pools of standing water covered the grass, and I could see a clear path where water had flowed down from my property line. The ground was completely saturated. "It rained last night, just a normal spring shower," Greg said. "But now, instead of draining through your gravel like it always did, all that water is running off your asphalt and flooding my property." We went into his basement through the exterior entrance. He was not exaggerating. Water covered the concrete floor, and I could see the water line on the walls showing where it had risen. Boxes of stored items sat in the water, their contents ruined. A dehumidifier sat unplugged in the corner, and the whole space smelled of mildew. "Greg, I am so sorry. I had no idea this would happen. You need to fix this. Now, I have got thousands of dollars in damage down here." I called Larry immediately. He agreed to come by that afternoon to assess the situation. In the meantime, I helped Greg move things out of his basement and set up a pump to drain the water. It took most of the morning. As we worked, another neighbor appeared, this one from the house diagonal to mine, Michelle Carter. "Are you having drainage problems?" she asked Greg. "Yeah, from his new driveway," Greg said, jerking his thumb at me. Michelle's face fell. "Oh no, my basement has water too. I thought maybe I had a pipe leak, but if it is related to the rain." We went to check Michelle's basement, and sure enough, she had the same problem. Not as bad as Greg's, maybe an inch of water, but definitely flooded. By the time Larry arrived at 3 that afternoon, I had discovered that 4 houses on the street behind mine all had water in their basements. Word was spreading fast, and people were angry. They all blamed me. Larry walked the area, examining the grading, checking the slope, and taking measurements. Finally, he came back to where I stood with a growing crowd of wet, angry neighbors. "Okay, here is the situation," Larry said. The original gravel driveway was essentially acting like a rain garden. Water would hit it and percolate down through the stones into the soil. That soil has a natural slope that directs water toward these properties in the back, but it was a gradual, dispersed flow that the ground could absorb. "And now," I asked, "now you have got a 720 square foot impermeable surface. When it rains, all that water immediately runs off the asphalt. We graded it correctly so it does not pool on your driveway, which means it is running off to the sides and back. Because of the natural slope of the land, it is all flowing downhill, concentrated into streams instead of dispersed. The ground cannot absorb it fast enough, so it is collecting and finding its way into these basements." "So what do we do?" Greg demanded. Larry scratched his head. "You need a proper drainage solution. French drains, maybe a catch basin, something to collect and redirect the water." "How much would that cost?" I asked, dreading the answer. "For an area this size, probably $15,000 to $20,000. The neighbors erupted in anger. Everyone started talking at once, yelling about damages, repairs, and lawyers. I stood there feeling sick. I had just spent $7,500 to fix a problem that was not really a problem, and now I had created a much bigger problem that would cost even more to fix. That evening, I received a strongly worded letter from Greg's attorney. 2 days later, I received similar letters from the other 3 affected homeowners. They were demanding I fix the drainage issue and pay for all damages to their basements. The total they were claiming was over $60,000. I consulted with my own attorney, Daniel Perkins, who specialized in property disputes. "This is a mess," Daniel said, reviewing the letters in his downtown Cincinnati office. "The problem is, you did not do anything wrong. You complied with the HOA requirements, but in doing so, you altered the drainage pattern of your property, which has damaged your neighbor's properties. So am I liable? Probably. Ohio law holds property owners responsible for drainage issues they create, even if the creation was unintentional. The fact that the HOA forced you to make the change does not absolve you of liability to your neighbors. So what do? You could sue the HOA, arguing that their requirement forced you to create this situation, but that would be a tough case. The covenants give them broad authority to set standards. I left Daniel's office feeling trapped. I could not afford to pay for everyone's damages plus fix the drainage, but I also could not afford not to do anything. The lawsuits would ruin me. That is when I decided to go directly to Patricia Hendricks. If the HOA had forced this situation, maybe they would help resolve it. I found Patricia at the clubhouse Tuesday evening, where the HOA board was having their monthly meeting. I waited until the meeting ended, then approached her as she gathered her papers. "Patricia, I need to talk to you about a serious problem." She looked up, her expression cold. "If this is about a violation, you can submit it in writing. It is about my driveway, the one you forced me to repave." I forced nothing. I simply enforced the community standards you agreed to when you purchased your property. And now 4 of my neighbors have flooded basements because of the drainage changes. They are threatening to sue me for tens of thousands of dollars. Patricia's expression did not change. "That sounds like a problem between you and your neighbors. The only reason I repaved the driveway was because of your violation notice. The gravel was fine. It was not hurting anyone, but you insisted it looked cheap. The covenants are clear." "Patricia, please. There has to be something the HOA can do. Maybe help pay for the drainage solution, or at least waive any restrictions on what I need to do to fix it." She snapped her binder shut and stood up. "Mr. Patterson, the HOA is not responsible for your poor planning. You should have considered drainage before you hired your contractor. That is not our problem." She walked past me and out the door. I stood there, my hands shaking with frustration and anger. This woman had forced me into this situation, and now refused to accept any responsibility for the consequences. The next day, I received official legal complaints from all 4 neighbors. They were suing me jointly for damages, repairs, and the cost of waterproofing their basements. The total amount was now listed as $78,000. I called an emergency meeting with my attorney. "I want to sue the HOA," I said. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "On what grounds? They created this situation. They forced me to repave the driveway knowing, or should have known, that it would cause drainage problems. Did anyone from the HOA ever evaluate the drainage situation before requiring the repaving? No. Did they provide any guidelines or requirements regarding drainage when they issued the violation? No, they just said concrete or asphalt, nothing about drainage." Daniel drummed his fingers on his desk. "Okay, here is what I am thinking. We file a third-party complaint against the HOA, arguing negligence. They enforced a covenant without considering the reasonable consequences, and that negligence directly led to the damages. We also argue that they had a duty to consider the drainage implications before requiring the change, especially since the gravel driveway had been functioning without problems for decades." Will that work? Honestly, maybe. It is unusual, but you have a decent argument. The HOA has broad powers, but those powers come with responsibilities. They cannot force you to make changes that create hazardous conditions without some oversight. We filed the lawsuit the following week. I sued the HOA for the full amount of the damages my neighbors were claiming, plus my own costs for repaving the driveway and any drainage solutions needed. I also filed a complaint with the Ohio Department of Commerce, which oversees HOAs in the state, alleging that Meadowbrook Estates HOA was enforcing covenants in a reckless manner that created property damage. Patricia's response was swift and vicious. Each violation came with a $100 fine. I was being charged $600 for completely made-up or trivial violations. It was clear Patricia was retaliating. Daniel immediately filed an additional complaint for harassment and filed for a temporary restraining order against the HOA collecting any of the fines until the lawsuit was resolved. The judge granted it. As spring turned into summer, the legal battle intensified. My neighbors were understandably frustrated. Their basements kept flooding every time it rained, and the damage was accumulating. I felt terrible about it, but I also could not fix the problem without either accepting full liability, which would bankrupt me, or waiting for the lawsuit to resolve. In June, we had our first major court hearing. Both my neighbor's lawsuit against me and my lawsuit against the HOA were being heard together since they were related. The courtroom in the Hamilton County Courthouse was packed with people from the neighborhood. Word had spread about the case, and apparently, I was not the only one who had issues with Patricia's reign as HOA president. The neighbor's attorney went first, laying out their case. They had photos of the flooded basements, receipts for damaged property, estimates for waterproofing and repairs. Their expert witness, a civil engineer, testified that the change from gravel to asphalt had definitively altered the drainage pattern and caused the flooding. Then, Daniel presented our defense and counterclaim. He argued that while the physical change to my driveway had caused the flooding, I had been compelled to make that change by the HOA under threat of escalating fines. He presented the violation notice, the HOA covenants, and Larry as our expert witness. Larry testified about the drainage situation, explaining how the gravel had been acting as a natural rain garden, and how a proper drainage evaluation should have been done before any such substantial change was required. In my professional opinion, Larry said, no responsible HOA should require a change of this magnitude without first assessing the drainage implications. It is a basic consideration in any property modification. The HOA's attorney, a sharp woman named Victoria Sims, argued that property owners are responsible for understanding the implications of any changes they make, regardless of what prompted those changes. She claimed the HOA had no duty to evaluate every individual property situation, and that the covenants were clear and legally binding. Patricia herself testified, dressed in a navy business suit and speaking in clipped, precise tones. The rules exist to maintain property values and community standards, she said. Mr. Patterson's gravel driveway was an eyesore. Multiple residents had complained about it. We were simply enforcing the covenants that every homeowner agreed to. Did you or anyone from the HOA board evaluate the drainage situation before requiring the change? Daniel asked during cross-examination. That is not the HOA's responsibility. Did you consider the possibility that requiring this change might cause property damage? Property owners are responsible for complying with the covenants in a responsible manner. That is not what I asked. Did you personally consider the drainage implications? Patricia's jaw tightened. No, it was not relevant to the violation. So you admit that you required a major property modification without any consideration of the potential consequences. The consequences of not maintaining community standards are decreased property values for everyone. The hearing lasted 3 days. At the end, the judge, a weary-looking man in his 60s named Judge Raymond Foster, said he would review all the evidence and issue a ruling within 60 days. Those 60 days were some of the worst of my life. I was barely sleeping, my savings were being drained by legal fees, and I could not walk out my front door without seeing angry neighbors. Greg Sullivan would not even make eye contact with me anymore. Michelle Carter had taken to parking across the street from my house and just glaring at it. To make matters worse, it was an unusually wet summer. Every rainstorm meant more flooding, more damage, and more anger. I offered multiple times to at least help with the cleanup, but most of the affected neighbors wanted nothing to do with me until the legal situation was resolved. In late July, something changed. I was checking my mail when an older woman I did not recognize approached me. She was probably in her 70s with gray hair and kind eyes. "You are Parker Patterson, right? The one suing the HOA?" "Yes," I said cautiously. "Good, I am Dorothy Winters. I used to live 3 streets over before I moved last year to be closer to my daughter. Patricia Hendricks and that HOA board are a menace. When I heard about your lawsuit, I knew I had to reach out." "Okay." Dorothy handed me a thick manila envelope. "These are documents from when I was fighting with the HOA. Patricia forced me to remove a garden shed that had been on my property for 20 years. She said it was not in compliance with the current rules, even though it was grandfathered in. When I refused, she fined me into oblivion. I eventually just sold the house and moved rather than deal with her anymore." I opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of documents, violation notices, board meeting minutes, and email exchanges. "Look at the board meeting minutes from March of last year," Dorothy said. "You will find them interesting." I flipped through until I found them. As I read, my eyes widened. The minutes showed that the board had discussed the driveway covenant specifically. There was a note that read, "Discussion of covenant enforcement regarding non-conforming driveways." Several properties grandfathered under old rules. Board votes to require compliance upon property transfer. Motion to waive requirement if structural or drainage issues exist. Motion fails 3-2. Patricia Hendricks, Sandra Wells, and Thomas Chen vote against waiver provision. "You see it?" Dorothy asked. They specifically discussed making exceptions for drainage issues. Patricia voted against it. She knew this could be a problem and chose to enforce the rule anyway. This was huge. This showed that the HOA board had actually considered the drainage question and deliberately chose not to include any exceptions or evaluation requirements. It demonstrated recklessness, maybe even malice. I immediately sent copies to Daniel, who was ecstatic. "This changes everything," he said over the phone. "This shows they knew or should have known that drainage could be an issue, and they chose to enforce the covenant anyway without any safety provisions. This is negligence, possibly gross negligence." We filed an emergency motion to reopen discovery and include the new evidence. The judge granted it. We also deposed Sandra Wells and Thomas Chen, the other board members who had voted with Patricia. Sandra was a nervous woman in her 50s who clearly regretted her vote. "I just thought the driveways looked nicer with pavement," she said during her deposition. Patricia was very persuasive about property values. I did not really think about drainage specifically. Thomas Chen was more defensive. "We are volunteers trying to maintain a nice community," he said. "We cannot be expected to evaluate every technical detail of every property. That is what homeowners hire contractors for. But you specifically voted against a provision that would have required drainage evaluation," Daniel pressed, "because it seemed like an unnecessary complication. The covenant is simple, concrete or asphalt. Making exceptions and requiring evaluations would have made it too complicated to enforce." The depositions made it clear that the board had prioritized aesthetic enforcement over practical considerations, even when they knew drainage could be an issue. In August, I received a call from a Cincinnati news station. A reporter named Jessica Morin had heard about the case and wanted to do a story on HOA overreach. "I have been investigating aggressive HOAs in the Cincinnati area," she said. "Your case seems like a perfect example of an HOA causing real harm to residents by inflexibly enforcing rules." I agreed to an interview. So did Greg Sullivan and Michelle Carter, though they still blamed me as much as the HOA. Dorothy Winters also agreed to share her story. The segment aired on a Thursday evening. Jessica did an excellent job presenting the facts: the gravel driveway, the violation notice, the flooding, the lawsuit, and the board minutes showing the HOA knew drainage could be an issue. She interviewed Patricia, who was stiff and defensive on camera. "Rules exist for a reason," Patricia said. "This community has standards, and I make no apologies for enforcing them. Even when that enforcement causes tens of thousands of dollars in damage," Jessica asked, "property owners need to take responsibility for their actions." The story went viral locally. Suddenly, everyone in Cincinnati was talking about HOAs and overreach. The online comments were running about 80% in my favor, with people sharing their own HOA horror stories. 2 days after the story aired, I received a call from a lawyer named Robert Franklin. "Mr. Patterson, I represent 15 other homeowners in Meadowbrook Estates who have issues with how Patricia Hendricks has been managing the HOA. We would like to discuss potentially joining forces to reform the board or dissolve the HOA entirely." This was unexpected. Dissolve the HOA. Under Ohio law, HOA dissolution requires 70% of homeowners to vote in favor. "We have been quietly polling residents, and we believe we have the votes. People are tired of Patricia's reign. Your lawsuit has brought everything to a head." I met with Robert and the group of homeowners the following week. Their stories were remarkably similar to mine and Dorothy's. Forced expensive modifications for aesthetic reasons, constant violation notices for trivial issues, and fines that seemed designed to punish rather than encourage compliance. One couple had been fined $5,000 for painting their front door a shade of red that was supposedly not approved, even though it was nearly identical to the approved color swatch. Another man had been threatened with foreclosure over a dispute about his fence height that was off by 2 inches. "Patricia runs the HOA like her personal fiefdom," Robert said. "She interprets the covenants in the most restrictive way possible and shows no flexibility or common sense. The other board members are either intimidated by her or too passive to stand up to her." We decided on a 2-pronged approach. First, we would push forward with my lawsuit to hold the HOA legally responsible for the drainage damage. Second, we would organize a vote to either remove Patricia and the current board or dissolve the HOA entirely. In September, Judge Foster finally issued his ruling. I was at Daniel's office when we got the news. The judge ruled that I was technically liable for the drainage changes to my property, but that the HOA shared substantial responsibility for requiring the modification without any drainage assessment. He ordered that the costs of fixing the drainage system and repairing the damaged basements be split, with me paying 30% and the HOA paying 70%. He also ordered the HOA to reimburse me for the cost of repaving my driveway, since the requirement had been enforced without proper consideration of the consequences. The total came to about $92,000 for drainage repairs and basement restoration. I was responsible for about $27,000, which I could manage with a home equity loan. The HOA owed about $65,000 plus my $7,500 in repaving costs. The judge also issued a permanent injunction preventing the HOA from enforcing any major structural covenants, without first requiring a professional assessment of the potential impacts. Any homeowner facing a violation for driveways, additions, or other major modifications had the right to request an impact assessment at the HOA's expense. It was not a total victory, but it was huge. The judge had essentially ruled that HOAs could not blindly enforce rules without considering the consequences. Patricia was furious. The HOA's attorney immediately filed an appeal, but the damage was done. The ruling had validated everything I had been arguing. The news story got a follow-up segment, and Jessica Moran interviewed Judge Foster about his ruling. HOAs serve an important function in maintaining communities, the judge said, but they are not immune from basic standards of reasonableness and duty of care. You cannot force homeowners to make expensive modifications without considering whether those modifications might cause harm. With the ruling in hand, the group of disgruntled homeowners moved forward with our plan. Robert filed the paperwork for a special election to vote on dissolving the HOA. Under the covenants and Ohio law, we needed 70% of the 347 homes in Meadowbrook Estates to vote yes. That meant 243 homeowners. Patricia fought it tooth and nail. She sent out mass mailings warning that dissolving the HOA would cause property values to plummet and turn the neighborhood into a free-for-all of unmaintained properties and chaos. She organized her own group of supporters who went door-to-door campaigning to keep the HOA intact. But her support was thin. Too many people had been burned by her aggressive enforcement. The election was scheduled for the first Saturday in October. In the meantime, work began on the drainage system. Larry's company won the contract to install French drains along my property line and catch basins to collect and redirect the water. It was a massive project that took 3 weeks. They dug trenches 4 feet deep, installed perforated pipes surrounded by gravel, and created underground channels that directed the water to a retention pond at the back edge of the development. My neighbors watched the work with guarded optimism. When the first rainstorm came after the installation, everyone held their breath. The next morning, Greg Sullivan knocked on my door. "No water," he said simply. "First time in 6 months." "That is great," I said, genuinely relieved. "Look, I know this whole thing was not entirely your fault. I should not have been so angry at you personally. Patricia forced your hand. I appreciate that, and I am sorry your basement got flooded. If I had known, I never would have just paved without thinking about it." We shook hands, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. One by one, the other affected neighbors came by with similar sentiments. Michelle Carter even brought me cookies as an apology for the death glares. The Saturday of the election arrived. The vote was held at the clubhouse, and the turnout was massive. Nearly 90% of homeowners showed up, which Robert said was unheard of for HOA elections. I stood outside the clubhouse with a group of other homeowners as the votes were counted. Patricia was inside, watching the process like a hawk, surely looking for any irregularities to challenge. After 2 hours, Robert emerged with the results. 291 votes in favor of dissolution, 56 votes against. Cheers erupted from the crowd. We had done it. The HOA was officially dissolved. The covenants would remain as deed restrictions, enforceable only through individual lawsuits rather than HOA fines. But the board, the violation notices, and Patricia's reign were over. Patricia stormed out of the clubhouse, her face red with fury. "You have all made a terrible mistake," she shouted. "This neighborhood will turn into a slum within a year. Property values will crater. Do not come crying to me when you cannot sell your houses." She got into her Lexus and peeled out of the parking lot. Most people just laughed. A few people actually applauded, but the story did not end there. In November, the HOA officially transferred its remaining assets, mostly the clubhouse and common areas, to a property management company that would maintain them through voluntary dues. The transition was smooth. Then, in December, the state investigation into the HOA's practices concluded. The Ohio Department of Commerce had been reviewing the complaint I had filed months earlier, along with complaints from other homeowners. Their findings were damning. The investigation revealed that Patricia had been misappropriating HOA funds for years. She had been using the HOA credit card for personal expenses, paying for her own landscaping with HOA money, and had even taken a vacation to Florida that she had charged to the association, claiming it was to attend an HOA management conference that did not exist. The total amount of misappropriated funds was over $43,000. The state referred the case to the Hamilton County Prosecutor's Office for criminal charges. I learned about this from Jessica Morin, who called me for another interview. "Did you have any idea Patricia was stealing from the HOA?" she asked. "No. I mean, I knew she was abusive and unreasonable, but I did not know about the theft. The prosecutors are charging her with theft in office, a fourth-degree felony, and tampering with records. If convicted, she could face up to 18 months in prison." The news spread through the former HOA community like wildfire. People were shocked, angry, and for some, it explained a lot. Sandra Wells and Thomas Chen, the other board members, claimed they had no knowledge of Patricia's theft and cooperated fully with investigators. Patricia's trial was scheduled for March of the following year. I attended, along with dozens of other Meadowbrook Estates residents. We wanted to see justice served. The prosecution laid out a detailed case. Bank statements showing HOA funds transferred to Patricia's personal accounts. Credit card statements with charges for personal items, restaurants, and that fake conference trip to Florida. Forged board meeting minutes approving expenses that the board had never actually approved. Patricia had been systematically looting the HOA for nearly 3 years. Her defense attorney tried to argue that the records were poorly kept and that Patricia had simply made accounting errors, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Foster, the same judge who had ruled on my lawsuit, sentenced Patricia to 14 months in prison, 3 years of probation, and ordered her to pay full restitution of $43,000 plus court costs. Her husband, who apparently had been completely unaware of her activities, filed for divorce before she even went to prison. Standing outside the courthouse after the sentencing, Greg Sullivan turned to me. "You know, if you had not stood up to her over that driveway, none of this would have come out. She would still be running the HOA like a dictator and stealing from all of us." "I just wanted to keep my gravel driveway," I said with a laugh. "And instead, you took down a corrupt HOA president and saved the neighborhood. Not bad." Life in Meadowbrook Estates slowly returned to normal. Without the HOA enforcement, people relaxed. Some folks kept their properties immaculate because they wanted to. Others were a bit more casual. A few people even switched back to gravel driveways since there was no longer anyone to tell them they could not. I kept my asphalt driveway. After everything I had gone through to get it, it seemed wasteful to tear it out. Plus, with the new drainage system, it worked fine. The clubhouse stayed open under the new management company, and surprisingly, more people used it than when the HOA was in charge. Without the oppressive atmosphere Patricia had created, neighbors actually wanted to socialize. We started having regular community cookouts and holiday parties. I paid off my portion of the drainage costs over the next 2 years. The HOA's insurance eventually covered most of their portion, though there was a lengthy fight about whether the policy covered board negligence. They settled for a lower amount, and the difference came from the HOA's reserve funds, which were substantial since Patricia's theft had been discovered before she could drain everything. Dorothy Winters came to one of our summer cookouts, making the drive from her daughter's place to visit old friends and see how the neighborhood had changed. "I heard you kept your asphalt driveway," she said, finding me by the grill. "Yeah, seemed like a waste to change it again after all that." "Smart, and the neighborhood seems happy." "It is better. No more violation notices, no more surprise fines, people just live their lives." "That is how it should be. HOAs can be good when they are run reasonably, but people like Patricia turn them into weapons. I am glad you fought back." I thought about that a lot over the following months. HOAs are not inherently evil. They can maintain property values, organize community activities, and handle shared responsibilities. But they need checks and balances. They need board members who see their role as serving the community, not ruling it. And they need homeowners who are willing to speak up when things go wrong. My experience taught me that standing up to institutional power is exhausting, expensive, and stressful. There were many times I wanted to just give up, pay the fines, and keep my head down. But if I had done that, Patricia would still be terrorizing homeowners and stealing money. The drainage issue would have eventually happened to someone else, and that person might not have had the resources to fight back. In a strange way, I was glad the whole thing happened. Not the flooded basements or the legal bills, obviously. But it connected me to my neighbors in a way that never would have happened otherwise. It taught me about property law, drainage systems, and HOA governance. And it showed me that ordinary people can take on entrenched power and win, even when the odds seem stacked against them. My gravel driveway had looked cheap, according to Patricia. But forcing me to change it had cost her everything: her position, her reputation, her freedom, and nearly split a community apart. In the end, the real cost was never about gravel versus asphalt. It was about power, accountability, and what happens when people abuse authority for too long. 2 years after the whole ordeal started, I was sitting on my front porch on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee and watching the neighborhood wake up. Greg Sullivan waved as he backed out of his driveway. Michelle Carter was working in her garden. A new family was moving into the house 3 doors down, unloading boxes from a rental truck. I wondered if they knew the story of what had happened here. Probably not. Real estate agents do not usually mention dissolved HOAs and imprisoned former presidents during house tours. But the neighborhood was better for it. Freer, friendlier, more like an actual community than a managed subdivision. My phone buzzed with a text from Larry Rodriguez. He was asking if I wanted to grab lunch and discuss a potential job. He was bidding on a large commercial paving project and wanted to ask my advice since I had become something of an expert on drainage issues. I texted back yes and smiled. Who would have thought that a fight over a gravel driveway would lead to new friendships, community reform, and even career opportunities? As I stood up to head inside and get ready, I took one last look at my asphalt driveway. It was smooth, black, and completely unremarkable. Just like every other driveway on the street. Exactly what Patricia had wanted, but the difference was, now it was my choice to keep it that way. No violation notices, no threats, no fines. Just a normal driveway on a normal suburban street with a pretty interesting story behind it. And sometimes, that is all you can ask for.